Okay, hello. My name is P. Oliver, and I will be discussing about Filipino resiliency and Aristotelian evaluation. Now, in here, I'll be discussing about my paper in which I used a framework from Aristotle, specifically his views about virtue and the virtuous mean in the Nicomachean Ethics, to be able to evaluate the virtue of Filipino resiliency. Now, before I continue, I do want to put in the disclaimer that this is not an attack on the virtue of Filipino resiliency. This is not me attempting to say that uh, it is an unneeded virtue or that uh, it will be an outdated virtue. Rather, I'm trying to provide my evaluation based on Aristotle's framework that events may have caused it to have a diluted value within our society, according to Aristotle's framework, that needs rectification in order for it to have the value it once held. Now, on the topic of this, Aristotle believed in a balance of virtue. He also believed in the need for virtue within life, and that it was in doing virtuous good that a human was able to excel in their character, was able to be better, not just as a person, but as a member of society. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he talked about the virtuous mean, in that in the practice of a virtue, one must be sure that their practice is neither lacking nor excessive, because both dilute the meaning and the value of that virtue and causes you to have a more negative usage of that virtue. You're not able to handle that virtue correctly or properly. With this, Aristotle believed that the mean or the average was the appropriate area for one to be able to practice their virtue. It should neither be too little in the sense that you are essentially not doing the virtue at all, or too much, wherein overcommitment to a virtue might be deemed as unvirtuous in itself. And the reason for this is that there must be a balance in the life of a person. They must be able to guarantee that if they are virtuous, they are not excessive to the point of self destruction. Being generous is a virtue. Not having it or having a lack of generosity causes you to be a bad person towards those around you. You might be deemed selfish, less willing to give, less willing to provide assistance. An excess of generosity on the other hand might cause you to lose the mortal possessions that you had, thus causing you to be the one in need of generosity in the future. You will be unable to care for yourself, unable to care for your family, etc. I pause. Now, the main argument of the paper is that I believe there is a corrosion of the worth and value of the virtue of Filipino resiliency, in the sense that I believe actions or situations has caused us to have an excessive use of Filipino resiliency. I will attempt to determine this by first using a specific example of a situation in which the use of Filipino resiliency was needed. So in this, I determined in the paper that I placed parameters within what can be and what can not be deemed Filipino resiliency, at least only in the basis of this paper itself. I do not attempt to claim that it is the correct and only use of Filipino resiliency that a person must have. And the reason I do not do that is because Aristotle himself actually believes that the virtuous mean was a highly objective thing that needed the clarifications of the situation a person found themselves in. Uh, with that, there needed to be a appropriate balance for what the virtuous mean would be that could only be found by the person who is actually practicing that virtue. Now, the first of the parameters that I placed in for what counted as the virtuous mean was that I believed it needed to not affect just a single person. So I was looking at this as more of a non-personal attack, despite the fact that Aristotle believes in the subjectivity uh, of the virtuous mean. Sorry, I may have allow me to restate this. I may have said it incorrectly. Aristotle believes in the subjectivity. He believes that the virtuous mean is subjective to what the person practicing that virtue is. The reason I used the reason I wanted to use uh situations that didn't necessarily target the person was because I didn't want to necessarily use um for example the death of a loved one for what I would count as the uh need for Filipino resiliency. And I only say that because um I believed that having a disaster situation wherein it affects more people tends to be the general outlook of what people view Filipino resiliency as. So in this, I also wanted the act of the resiliency to essentially be getting on with life, business as usual, either the rebuilding efforts or the uh, use or going back to school or going back to work. I didn't want to focus on the relief efforts done by volunteers only because I viewed it as a different virtue to what we're discussing right now. And the last parameter I included was that the situation must be one that the government could have or may have responded to. The reason for this is that the current view that some people have with Philippine resiliency tends to be tied towards natural disasters. So in this, it actually becomes a two-part relationship wherein we need to be able to have both the response, the actual assistance provided by the government, and also the actual practice of the virtue by the citizens. So in my findings, I essentially focused on research and newspaper testimonies that tended to focus on Typhoon Yolanda as my target event for Philippine resiliency. And what I found there was that on the part of the government, there was a lacking capability in their ability to provide assistance for the people affected by Yolanda. Now, again, I place a disclaimer that this is not an attack on the government. I do not mean to say that they did nothing. I'm only stating that as an actor alone, not including the assistance provided by other nations and other non-government units or organizations, the Philippine government actually provided assistance that I would deem to be insufficient. The reason for this would be the messy rebuilding processes that different sources have claimed to be either messy, to be uncoordinated, uh, funding for rebuilding process, which actually took years to accomplish, uh, as well as the fact that other people believe that in terms of the assistance provided by the government, it tended to have it was a failure in their part. Some sources have flat out declared the Filipino government's actions to have been close to a failure, if not for the assistance of other countries and of other organizations to have the initiative to take it upon themselves in order to rebuild and recover from Yolanda. Now, the reason I want to emphasize the inability of the government to provide a better response, and I want to focus on the term better response, is that it would have cost more on the end of the Filipino people to have rebuild themselves, their homes, their areas, uh, and thus force them to practice more of the virtue of Filipino resiliency when it could have been unneeded. Now, in here, I explained that the excessive use of Filipino virtue is actually tied down towards the proofs and testimonies that shine a light on the government actions as being inadequate. And it is based on the inadequacy of the Filipino government that we had used more Filipino resiliency than what should have been needed in Aristotle's virtuous mean. I defend this by positing that the lack of the Filipino virtue within the context of Typhoon Yolanda would have caused us to essentially give up, not choose to rebuild, maybe move somewhere else. And I'm not trying to attack those who may have chosen those options, but I only present it as an aspect within this framework, while the excess would have been that if people were not provided the assistance, they would have been forced to use more of their money in the rebuilding. They may have taken part in the rebuilding themselves. It could have caused injuries, sicknesses, etc. That would have gotten people hurt, either physically, emotionally, or financially, when it should have been handled better by the government. And there are government statements done later on, especially during speeches in our yearly commemoration of those affected by Typhoon Yolanda, that once again provides an emphasis on the need for Philippine resiliency. Some people have begun writing that Philippine resiliency is too overused in these situations. The focus shouldn't be on having the people rebuild for themselves. The focus should always be that the government is expected to care for the people and provide the resources needed that would allow them to rebuild properly and to rebuild efficiently and safely. So it is with that I ultimately evaluate that Filipino resiliency within the context of Typhoon Yolanda especially has suffered a degradation in its value due to the inability of the government to have provided adequate and more capable assistance during that time. I defend this by the usage of, again, Aristotle's virtuous mean framework, and establish that the inability of the government to have provided for better resources, better planning, better understanding towards the effect that the people ultimately had towards the effect that these people ultimately suffered from would have caused them to have an excessive usage of this virtue and thus causing said degradation of this virtue either in a more social understanding or in a more Aristotelian understanding.